Hello and welcome to Have I Got News For You? I'm Victoria Coren Mitchell. It's week 4 of lockdown, and with everyone cooped up together, couples are really finding out who wears the trousers. And the answer is no one anymore. What's the point? You're not wearing a pair, are you, Ian?
No. I've just got a range of tops for suits.
I'm finding it delightful that you're wearing a suit and tie every week. Thank you very much. Paul, you been keeping busy?
Yes, I've built my own spaceship, and I'm currently circulating the Earth at a height of 13 feet, thereby maintaining a 6-foot distance from even our tallest citizens.
Joining Ian tonight is Deborah Meaden, star of Dragon's Den. Obviously you can't record that now, as no one's allowed to say I'm out. How are you down in Somerset, Deborah?
I was having a lovely time, but I'm now getting a little fed up of feeding animals and weeding the garden. So yeah, I'm ready, raring to go.
Apparently you've got 7 horses, a pig, 3 sheep, so you're all right for food, I assume.
But I don't actually eat the horses.
Yet.
And on Paul's team tonight is the comedian Phil Wang. He was due to record a show for Netflix in May. Now he'll just be watching Tiger King like everyone else. Phil, your latest show is a profound meditation about morality and the modern sense of self. So you're used to not hearing any laughs?
Yes, yeah. So this recording should come very naturally.
Let's have a look at what's been going on this week. There's been some fun stuff on the internet. A grandmother has gone viral playing football in her back garden. What nickname do you think the internet have given that grandma?
Is it Granny Lineker?
Granny Lineker, that's good.
It must be Jimmy Savile. Does she not look like Jimmy Savile to you?
No.
Yeah.
Give us a break,
Crying
Deborah.
out.
No?
Phil, what do you think the press might have nicknamed the granny?
Nana Donna.
You're the closest.
Oh, that's very good.
She's been nicknamed Granaldo.
Granaldo, I mean, that's just dreadful.
Let's have a look at the weatherman from BBC Wales, Owen Wyn Evans, having to segue from his report into the main BBC News.
That's the forecast. Stay safe, and I'll see you soon.
Excellent.
That's what I'll be doing after each joke.
Let's get on with the show, and we'll start with the biggest stories of the week. Ian and Deborah, have a look at this.
He's back. Easter miracle. There he is, which is good.
Oh, Matt Hancock, checking he's still got hair after all his worry. Pretty, sticking with the pictures. Going to do colouring in rather than numbers.
Right, you, sunbathing. Oi, keep your distance.
Actually, I kind of do think they should stop them for sunbathing, but I thought it was ironic because he was actually about 4 metres away and then he approached to within about a metre.
I like the way as well in that video where the policeman originally went for his loud hailer, which I assumed the camera was going to pan round and we would see somebody like 200 feet away, but he was actually right there, so made me laugh, that. Most
of the issues were lost under the fact that the Prime Minister's all right again. He's come out of hospital, he's fine. And because it was at Easter, a lot of the, let's say, more Tory press decided this was some sort of miracle and that Boris had become the Messiah. And someone was quoted, some senior Tory, saying he's risen. And as we all know, you know, he's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy.
Also, every time in the past when Boris has risen, it's never really led to anything more than trouble.
We're obviously very pleased and relieved that Boris Johnson is better. But what was ironic about his assessment of his treatment?
He listed the 2 nurses who'd looked after him, both of whom were immigrants, which again hadn't been the main focus of the right over the past 5 years or so in terms of dealing with the health service. So that was quite ironic.
Do you remember a vote in 2017?
There was a vote about doctors' pay, was there not? About whether it was a good idea, and various people in public life voted the other way and decided that the health workers weren't really worth any more money. And I'm afraid the Prime Minister was one of them.
Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, Michael Gove, they all voted against the pay rises. How else has Matt Hancock infuriated people on the front line?
The ones I know were most annoyed by his suggestion. Someone says we haven't got enough protective equipment, and he says you have, but you're just using it wrong. Now, the middle of a national crisis when the people at the front line are doing their best isn't always a great time to try and shift the blame towards them.
Matt Hancock's argument appears to be that the NHS would have enough PPE if only they don't use it.
The NHS has received some bonus equipment. Where's that come from, do you know?
I think they've had their quota of table tennis tables have been delivered 3 months ahead of schedule. I've no idea.
Where did the NHS get some extra ventilators from?
It wasn't like from soap operas or something, was it?
Oh yes, well done. Yeah, Holby City, wasn't it? Yes, well done, Phil. Yeah, exactly, Holby City. That's the answer.
Yeah, it's been terrible for Holby City. None of the plot stories make sense anymore because they haven't got a hospital left.
I was fascinated by the idea that Holby City has really good working I mean, have they got everything else? Have they got dialysis units, prenatal care? Have they got the lot there? I mean, I'd like to go. This is fantastic.
Shall we have a look at how the government have handled accusations of incompetence?
Badly.
Let's have a look.
But no apology, Home Secretary, for these failings which NHS staff and their families blame on the government.
Well, I'm sorry if people feel that there have been failings. I'll be very, very clear about that.
That's great. That's one of those I'm sorry if.
When I first started having, when I had a business that had customer complaints, to kind of protect ourselves, we'd use the if you feel. We're not admitting it. It's not our responsibility if you feel. You know, I mean, I learnt very quickly that really winds people up.
It just means if other people are so stupid as to take offence by the fact that I've done something they don't like, then I'm sorry for them. It's a non-apology.
Speaking of Priti Patel, did you see how when it was Priti Patel's turn to have a go at messing up the press briefing, her describing how many people have been tested for the coronavirus?
Oh.
Let's have a look.
I can report, through the government's ongoing monitoring and testing programme, that as of 9 a.m. today, there have been 974,000 tests carried out across the UK.
Phil, you've got an engineering degree. Just talk us through that number.
Yes, that number is what is known as sort of the Goldilocks point of the ideal number of tests to have. It's a very rare number. It's only been used a couple of times in history.
Isn't it more worrying that the Home Secretary can't read a number, so that this fine, if you go outside and you're sunbathing for 150 quid, might be 150,000 quid by the end of the week? Or if there's a prison sentence for walking your dog at the wrong time of day, maybe that'll be 10 years or 50 or 100,000 years. I'm genuinely worried. I mean, you know, we did quite a lot of jokes about the shadow Home Secretary, who wasn't very good on numbers in terms of the police. But, I mean, Priti Patel, she's in a league of her own. You've got to give it to the Tories. I mean, this is class number Wangology.
I tell you what, I went to a chemist the other day to get a thermometer, and whoever put the price on that, I think, was using Priti Patel's number system. I mean, that was a number plucked from the air.
I live with my sister, and in a moment of desperation, she brought back a meat thermometer because it's the only thing she could find. So we've got a thermometer about this big now. And it's not very accurate.
Where'd you put it?
Maybe don't answer that question. But what is going to happen to Parliament?
It's going to become virtual, isn't it? That they're all sort of going to be doing it a bit like the way we're doing this show, where people are going to be sitting at home, presumably, and I don't know how many MPs there are altogether. It's like 660, isn't it? Something like that. So they're all going to divide the TV screen up into 660 little squares, and they will all be invited to speak one at a time.
And it's being organised by Jacob Rees-Mogg, which could be quite funny on Zoom, because if he just lies down, we just won't see him at all. Just a blank bench. I can't wait.
According to The Guardian, a lot of MPs don't think the online Parliament will work because taking spontaneous interventions will be hard to facilitate via video conferencing. I think we're proving that wrong tonight. What's the good news for MPs? It's to do with money.
Well, they're getting £10,000 for working at home.
They are getting an allowance of £10,000 if they need things to help them work from home. What might they need that costs £10,000 to work from home?
Chairs, tables, videos, you know, stuff.
Duck houses. Do you need your wife as your secretary? That seems to be very, very important. And particularly if she's in the next room.
And what about the police? They're encouraging people to inform on their neighbours now for persistent rule infringement. How are people with holiday homes trying to get around being stopped with luggage in the car?
Oh, I don't know, but they're all driving down at night, aren't they? Wasn't there lots of rumours about clandestine driving down the A303?
They're driving down in their cars with no luggage, and they're getting a courier company to send the luggage on, so that when the police stop them and they say, "Are you moving down here?" they say, "No, we're not. We haven't got any luggage."
Which has given me the idea for a quiz. Shall we play a quiz?
Yes.
Have you got buzzers there?
I have.
Is that a real animal? I haven't got my glasses on.
No, that's my dog's squeaky toy.
Phil, what have you got?
I've got a candle in a jar.
Lovely. Ian, have you got a buzzer?
Yep. I've got a tin of multivitamins to go and supplement my frosty diet, which is very, very important.
Okay, I've got a tiny motorbike and sidecar, and I can make an engine noise for that to simulate the sound that it would be making if it was a real one.
Well, that's absolutely perfect. I hope there's no luggage in that car.
No, completely empty.
So, this quiz is about what you can and can't do during a lockdown, according to the police. I will give you an activity and you tell me whether you can do it or not. Fingers on buzzers. Kick a football in your front garden. Paul?
Yeah, you are allowed to, but somebody was stopped the other day and it was the police were being rather over officious because you are allowed to be in your own garden, but somebody was stopped and they were actually being stopped wrongly by the police.
According to the police, you cannot kick a football in your front garden if it doesn't look like a front garden. That's why a police officer in Rotherham stopped a father playing football with his kids, and the officer was described by their superior as ill-informed.
Since when did the police become landscape architects? Why are they the judge of what's a front garden?
Constable was known for his landscapes.
Next question, fingers on buzzers. Is it okay to drive to the Lake District in masks? Phil?
I'm going to say no.
You have to go in a motor vehicle. The mask will not sustain engine and wheels.
The answer is no. A family stopped in their car by police over Easter had driven up from London to the Lake District claiming this was okay because they were driving in gloves and masks. But the police fined them and then were rude about them on Twitter, calling them clowns and idiots. Is that all right, Ian, the police being rude about people on Twitter?
No, I think you know, if they want to do their job, that's great. But I think gloating about it afterwards on Twitter, no.
I chanced upon a burglary in progress the other day as I went on my run. Someone was trying to hack into an odd bins with a crowbar, just in broad daylight, literal daylight robbery. I guess they just felt confident that all the police were in the parks.
Did you intervene?
Well, no, I thought, fair play, we all need our booze.
Next question. Can you buy any item that's sold in a shop? Deborah?
I think everything except Easter eggs. They're not counted as necessary, are they? Although, personally, I think they're probably the only thing that's necessary over Easter.
Well, there's all sorts of things that might not be considered necessary in Northamptonshire. It was the Chief Constable of Northamptonshire Police, Nick Adderley, who said last week, it's only a matter of days before we start searching in someone's shopping trolley to see whether they've bought a legitimate, necessary item. But then Priti Patel said, no, it isn't, and slapped him down in that charming way she apparently has.
But surely it's better if people buy unnecessary items because we're running out of the necessary ones.
Can Phil be in the cabinet?
I probably will be burning next week.
I must admit that I bought 5 windmills last week. Completely unnecessary, but I can't resist a bargain.
Nobody needs more than 2 windmills.
I've got a wide social circle and there's a few birthdays coming up, so I want to wrap them up and make a surprise gift to people, although I've said what it is now, so I'm probably stuck with the windmills.
I read today that Jeff Bezos has made something like 90 billion million zillion pounds since the outbreak started. He's the only person on earth who's made more money than everyone else has lost combined. Again, I may have made that up, but there is some figure in there.
26 billion he's added to his personal wealth.
That's good going, isn't it?
Although the police are cracking down on certain activities, what was nevertheless quite popular over the Easter holidays? What were a lot of people getting up to that they shouldn't? It's to do with phones.
Oh, no.
Oh, masts.
5G masts.
They've been out destroying these 5G masks because apparently we can catch coronavirus through them.
Might this be true, the 5G thing?
No, and one of the giveaways is that Eamon Holmes said it might be. It's always worth having those key indicators flashing, and Eamon Holmes is certainly one of them. The other thing is, when he was questioned about it, he said that there was, he immediately said that this wasn't being challenged by state media. Now, as soon as someone talks about the British press as state media, you know they've been on the internet too long. It really is time for them to go out in the garden, have a bit of sunshine, and stop believing complete rubbish. And the idea that a 5G network can give you a virus it's not merely an opinion or an interesting conspiracy. It's just bollocks.
Eamon Holmes started trying to imply that the mainstream media was misrepresenting facts, failing to acknowledge that he was doing so on This Morning on ITV.
Shall we have a look at the footage?
But what I don't accept is mainstream media immediately slapping that down as not true when they don't know it's not true. No one should attack or damage or do anything like that, but it's very easy to say it is not true because it suits the state narrative.
There's his wife sitting next to him with that expression on her face that says, oh, here we go again. It's bad enough hearing this across the breakfast table without him now broadcasting to the dozens of people that are watching their show.
And amusingly, he then had to apologise. I mean, not for his show, which, I mean, it's long overdue, but for actually coming up with this nonsense.
Finally, how did Nigel Farage's nether regions cause a stir?
Oh, he did a Facebook Live or something in very short shorts and with the camera far too close to said short shorts.
No.
Does he play for West Ham? He's wearing their colours.
I mean, you have to admire his commitment to Brexit. Even his balls want to leave.
Yes, this is coronavirus, which has been in the news this week. Priti Patel gave her briefing flanked by government advisers who kept the strict 2 metres away from her, which the Home Office has recommended with Priti Patel for about 5 years. One of the first things Boris Johnson did on recovering from coronavirus was read some Tintin books. A part-time journalist with a little dog who, when you look back at some of the older stuff, comes across as a bit racist. Still, we're glad he's better. When it was announced that Boris Johnson was in recovery, there was also a terrible piece of news. His father was available for comment. Paul and Phil, take a look at this.
Right, that's the Welsh flag, isn't it? Yes, we're in a very slopey, steep road. The steepest road in the world has been held by this Welsh road. There's a man measuring it. Yes, there's been a controversy over what is the steepest road in the world. And I think that road in Wales was very proudly holding the record for the steepest road.
The Welsh road won the title off the New Zealand road last year. But now the New Zealand road has won it back. And I don't quite know how you've done that. I don't know how you win back steepest road.
The measurement has changed in some way. Have they sort of started measuring it from the curb or from further up the hill?
Did Priti Patel do the numbers?
The measuring system changed. So this is the new title holder, Baldwin Street in New Zealand. And here's the previous title holder, 4th Penllech Street in Harlech in Wales. According to the Times, the residents of Baldwin Street flew a local surveyor over on a fact-finding mission, and having examined the street, he realised that if the measurement was taken from the centre of each road rather than the outer edges, Baldwin Street was steeper.
Is this really something you want to be proud of? Because isn't this just like a result of bad town planning to have a very steep street? It's just a hazard, isn't it? It's like having the world's most dangerous roundabout or Europe's longest running house fire. Why would you be proud of this?
They shouldn't have built any houses up the top. That's the problem. You wouldn't need a road then.
Deborah, do you know or can you guess how businesses on that very steep but not world record breakingly steep street in Harlech have been affected?
Well, I should imagine that there would have been tourism attached to it. I should think they would get a lot of visitors. So I'm guessing they're a bit annoyed because they've lost their visitors.
You're absolutely right. Harlech councillor Hugh Jones told The Times, "I feel sorry for the shop owners. One man has just spent thousands on T-shirts and postcards." And of course, the greengrocer has real problems keeping his spherical goods under control. What's the best way to get from this story to one about Cliff Richard?
The Cliff Richard story is about the fact that he's got a new single out which isn't being played by radio stations as much as he would like. So therefore, to get his record into the charts would be very much an uphill struggle, which would be one link between one and the other.
Surely the segue should have been from a steep road to a cliff. I was born for the one show. I'm just entirely wasted.
Cliff Richard said in the Daily Mirror that he deserved a priority chance. You know, like being able to be the first person at Asda in the morning. And he felt that he was discriminated against because of age. And of course, he's lost his weather-dependent booking at Wimbledon as well, hasn't he, this year?
The onus is on him to stay relevant, so he needs to stay with the times and release his long-awaited drill album.
Is that where he just has a drill?
That's right, Ian, yeah.
Cliff Richard has produced CDs, cassettes, albums, and let's not forget all the old 78s. Seriously, let's not forget them. They're all stuck in their houses trying to get Cliff songs to work on Spotify. On the subject of planning, what has East London rapper Gets announced he's planning to do?
He's doing a tour in his house. So he's doing a gig in the bathroom, then another one in the living room, another one in the kitchen. I think a couple of them have sold out already. So there's one in the shed. There we are, look, sold out.
Speaking of home furnishings, what has Amanda Liberty been told about her sexual attraction to an antique chandelier?
Is the antique chandelier attracted to her? Is that what you're saying?
This is a person who complained to Ipso, the press regulator, that she'd been mocked by The Sun about having a sexual attraction to a chandelier, but she was told that her attraction to historic light fittings was not a protected sexual orientation.
Well, if she's into prehistoric light fittings, surely The Sun is up there.
The Sun claimed they had not invaded her privacy because she talked about her attraction for inanimate objects on many occasions, including a previous relationship she had with New York's Statue of Liberty. She moved on from the statue some time ago, although it still carries a torch for her. This is the Welsh village that lost the title of the world's steepest street to a town in New Zealand. It's a big story, if you're that way inclined. There's more bad news for residents of Forth Penclec. They've also lost the record for the world's fittest postman. Meanwhile, Cliff Richard has complained that his music is no longer played on the radio because of his age. To be fair, Cliff has had quite a lot of media attention. The BBC even sent a helicopter to his house. So, at the end of that round, 2 points each.
I can hear the ringing of a bell. Has somebody got something in the microwave?
It's our clock. I didn't think you'd be able to hear it in the panic room, but there it is. It came through the door.
Is that your panic room, Victoria?
Well, they're all panic rooms now, aren't they? Let's be honest.
It looks very, very formal.
Thank you. It's actually the murder inquiry room normally, but, you know, needs must. And so to round 2. In a change to the picture spin quiz this week, it's the image rotation conundrum. Fingers on buzzers, teams. You've changed your noise.
Yeah, I did, yeah. It's one of those things that the world is ever changing. I didn't really know the answer to this, but I just wanted to blow my whistle. Isn't this about monkeys were apparently 40,000 years ago sailed from one part of the world to another in a boat?
They travelled from Africa to South America on rafts of storm-tossed vegetation. Bit longer than 40,000 years ago. Ian, do you know how long?
It was before Thor Heyerdahl, that's all I know.
Before Thor?
Thor Heyerdahl, it was one of the Marvel franchises. It was terrific.
You're a fan of Marvel superhero movies?
I didn't say I was a fan, I said I was aware of them. It's rather like Sir Cliff Richard's music. I wouldn't say that I get up and dance to Devil Woman, but I am aware of his long and interesting oeuvre.
I think whenever Ian's local cinema shows one of these films, he's the first to organise a picket line.
These monkeys apparently sailed across the Atlantic over 30 million years ago on this sort of raft of vegetation. And what proof do you think the scientists have of this?
Ticket stubs?
Was it on the front cover of the first Private Eye?
Yeah, under the title Monkey Business.
The evidence is apparently that a set of fossilised teeth were found in Peru and they matched up with those of a monkey originating from Africa. So they're saying this must mean that the monkey travelled.
Unless the monkey had a particularly good dentist. I think I saw this in a film once, a Marvel film called Dentures That Time Forgot.
You know what the sailing monkeys were called?
Yes, I do.
Well, just for everyone else's benefit, they're a type of prehistoric monkey called that.
Eucalypithecus perdita. The lost eucalyptus monkey.
They were going to go with Boaty McBoatface, but they weren't allowed.
In other fossil news, scientists have discovered an example of the world's oldest bird. Deborah, what do you think that's called?
Oldest bird? Big Bird?
Is it KFC?
Its official name is that. Here's the bird. Let's have a look at it now. And here's how it used to look. It's definitely lost weight, isn't it? How has one sheep in South Yorkshire been helping police recently?
Recreational purposes? It's been fingerprinting suspects.
Basically, yes. Work purposes.
Oh, don't be
yes.
silly.
No, well, not with fingerprints, but it has been helping to enforce the lockdown. Let's have a look.
Is it saying go back, go back?
Finally, how has one man been helping his gerbils cope with lockdown?
Has he been tying him to bungee ropes and chucking him out the window? Well, I mean, I don't know. It's a difficult question to answer, really, because I don't know what would entertain a gerbil.
He's actually built them an art gallery. Here it is.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's a Vermeer and a Klimt and a Munch.
Das Munch's the squeak.
This is the story of a group of monkeys who crossed the Atlantic from Africa to South America 34 million years ago. According to the New Scientist, the monkeys crossed the Atlantic and landed in Peru, having passed a bear in a duffel coat going the other way. Also in the news, scientists have discovered a 66-million-year-old bird, which they've dubbed Wonder Chicken. Dr. Daniel Field from Cambridge University said finally discovering the Wonder Chicken in a quarry on the Belgian-Dutch border was the most exciting moment of my career. I know how he feels. I cried after queuing for hours outside Waitrose before getting my hands on the last pack of drumsticks. Here's your next rotating image quiz.
Donald Trump has had a meltdown to put even himself at shame. Confronted by a press briefing in Washington, took him to task on his response to coronavirus, and instead of accepting any responsibility, he just went on a tirade against them and how they're out to get him.
What video did he play during the press briefing for everyone to enjoy?
Well, it was a video of his greatest hits of everything that he's done right since January, but ignoring what he did in February, which was nothing.
But is it not the case, Deborah, that say what you like about Donald Trump, he is a tremendously astute and brilliant businessman?
Can I just say, Victoria, can you stop asking me questions? You're just fake. That's fake journalism. That is just fake. You're back. You're fake. That is just. Stop it. That's awful. No.
Let's have a look at it. Keep your eye on Trump as he plays this video about how great he is.
Interesting. We have a few clips that we're just going to put up. We could turn the lights a little bit lower. I think you'll find them interesting. And then we'll answer some questions. I'll ask you some questions because you're so guilty, but forget it. But most importantly, we're going to get back onto the reason we're here, which is the success we're having. Okay? Please, you could put it on. Thank you.
How worried should Americans be about coronavirus?
Coronavirus is not going to cause a major issue in the United States.
Well, we've asked them to accelerate whatever they're doing in terms of a vaccine.
Obviously, the news channels cut away then because they thought it was turning into a campaign video.
He has a problem with the role of the press, who he imagines are there to say that he's marvellous and he's done everything right. And he cannot get his head around the fact that somebody might not think he is marvellous, and this might be true. I mean, the video he played was an attack on the press. It was basically saying the press underestimated the strength of the pandemic, whereas he dismissed it as a hoax. He didn't underplay it. He said it didn't exist, but he left that bit out. He's too mad for Fox News. I mean, that's quite an achievement.
But let's reassure ourselves that Donald Trump is across the finer detail of the pandemic. Here he is sharing his expert knowledge.
The germ has gotten so brilliant that the antibiotic can't keep up with it. And they're constantly trying to come up with a new. People go to a hospital and they go for a heart operation. That's no problem, but they end up dying from problems. You know the problems I'm talking about. There's a whole genius to it. We're fighting, not only is it hidden, but it's very smart.
Well, that makes one of them.
It's like he's learned everything he knows about germs from those toilet cleaning ads. You know, the ones where the germs have got faces, you know, and they talk to you and they're clever little germs.
Yeah, I think he's confronted his first enemy that he can't sort of compliment into striking a deal with him. He doesn't know how to deal with it. He wants to take the virus to Mar-a-Lago and play a couple of rounds of golf with it, but he doesn't know how to handle this.
Well, he did provide some information about the number of tests being carried out in the United States, and he wasn't going to make a hash of it like Priti Patel. Let's find out what he said.
We've performed 1.87 million tests to date, so that's 1,870,000 million tests.
1,870,000 million. That's a lot of tests. Despite Donald Trump's scepticism, we have seen some evidence that Americans are using hand sanitizer. Where did the former vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin surprisingly turn up recently?
Did she turn up at Ian's house, banging on the bedroom window, let me in, let me in?
I tell you where she turned up. She turned up on the American version of The Masked Singer.
Ah.
Or I suppose Series 2 will be called The Singer. I want to know whether Ian still fancies her.
When did I say that? Was it 10 years ago, 15?
You said she was your type of woman.
Now you're just making it up. Find me the clip.
You did say she was a very attractive woman.
Yes, I did. Oh, really? There's nothing as humiliating as hindsight, is there?
This is the news that Donald Trump might not be the best person to tackle a global pandemic. At a White House briefing this week, Trump hit out at reporters in what one network described as the biggest ever meltdown from a US president. Well, since Bill Clinton got his dry cleaning bill. Donald Trump was full of praise for COVID-19 this week, describing it as a very brilliant enemy, a genius. It's very smart. No, Donald, not flattering the curve. Time now for the odd one out round. Just one between you this week. Your four are Cato, a 64-year-old Frenchman, Bernie Sanders, and Meghan and Harry.
Well, Meghan and Harry have just launched their foundation in Los Angeles. Bernie Sanders has withdrawn from the race. Cato's, I've no idea.
Cato used to launch himself, didn't he, at...
Inspector Clouseau, yeah.
What did Cato used to do?
Well, he used to attack Inspector Clouseau without warning to test Inspector Clouseau's reactions.
Well, if you'd got Boris, it would be that they've all hidden in a fridge. But he's not on there.
Did you hear about a 64-year-old man in Saint-Dizier in France causing a bit of a flap with the French Air Force? Did you see this story?
He went on a retirement present ride in a fighter jet and accidentally ejected himself out of it within seconds.
Yes, he was so nervous. He got given this present of a trip in a fighter jet, and the force made him float in his seat and involuntarily grab a lever next to him, and he accidentally ejected himself from the plane. Although he did land safely with a parachute in a nearby field, he was fine.
Harry and Meghan have ejected themselves from the royal family.
I think I might have to tell you, they have all made a surprising exit, except for Cato, who was known for making a surprise entrance. So this chap ejected himself from a plane.
There was nothing surprising about Bernie Sanders' exit. been predicted for the last 5 weeks.
And what about Meghan and Harry? Where have they gone that's a surprise?
Again, that's not very surprising.
No, we all knew they were going to Canada. What's surprising about that?
And then they went to Hollywood.
They've gone to LA.
They've left Canada.
They were always going to go to LA.
Yeah, this question's only surprising to people who don't know anything. Cato is making an exit from a fridge. This question...
You've got me there.
This question is an insult to us and to our viewers.
They have all made a surprising exit except for Cato, who was known for making a surprise entrance, unless you think of that entrance as an exit, in which case they've all made a surprise exit and there's no odd one out. Cato was played by the actor Burt Kwok, who, according to IMDb, played many roles, including Imperial Army Major Yamauchi in Tenko and Entwistle in Last of the Summer Wine. So both characters took part in atrocities then. A man in France nearly died when he accidentally ejected himself from a jet fighter at over 500 kilometres an hour. Terrifying, but he did at least get £250 from Harry Hill. Bernie Sanders caused a shock by ending his presidential campaign and endorsing Joe Biden. Despite being on the left of American politics, Joe Biden still doesn't support a national health service. And if 8 p.m. last night is anything to go by, neither do the people at number 28 on my street. You're on the list, Sue and Trevor. Time now for the Missing Words round, which this week features as its guest publication, Scuba Diver magazine. Dominic Rabb reads it. He likes to know there are other people who are out of their depth. And we start with, at the 2020 International Diving Show in Coventry, I was particularly impressed by what?
I was particularly impressed by the fact people found a way to go diving in a landlocked part of the country.
At the 2020 International Diving Show in Coventry, I was particularly impressed by Dick Proctor's hat.
The answer is, at the 2020 International Diving Show in Coventry, I was particularly impressed by the complimentary parking. The show was compared by Miranda Krestovnikov. And if you have a persistent Krestovnikov, please self-isolate. Next. Spanish diplomat's article on British culture describes what as filth and what as unsophisticated.
Is it police and Sir Philip Green?
Oh, it's not that.
Well, if they're Spanish, they might describe the word fills as filth because of their accent.
Right.
And a lack of desire for small plates of food as unsophisticated.
I think I'll give it to you because it is food. Spanish diplomat's article on British culture describes Marmite as filth and HP sauce as unsophisticated. It's the Spanish diplomat Ignacio Peiro who this week revealed that he hasn't enjoyed some of our culinary delicacies while living in Britain. An offended Daily Mirror article points out that Spanish delicacies include boiled, chewy pig's ear, tripe stew and bull's testicles, which I think are the main ingredients of Marmite. Next. Derek's diving kit is unconventional, as he uses what?
A goldfish bowl, 10 foot of hose pipe and a photograph of Jacques Cousteau.
It's not that.
His oxygen mask on the other end.
Yeah.
Derek's diving kit is unconventional as he uses his yellow AAS as his primary. Ridiculous. This, of course, is an article from Scuba Diver magazine which reveals that AAS stands for Alternative Air Supply. According to Scuba Diver UK, Derek was at the Skin Deep Dive Centre in Portland, which is easily reached. Follow the main road, A354, onto the causeway, carry on past the car park, turn left at the mini roundabout, and then follow the signs to the marina. Or carry on to the next roundabout, take the left turn and double back to join the marina access road. Now there's a man who's been commissioned to write a 1,000-word article. Next, new archaeological find shows that Neanderthals were able to what?
Able to balance a professional and family life.
New archaeological find shows that Neanderthals were able to grasp complex technologies and numeracy. This is the news that Neanderthals were smarter than we previously thought and were able to weave complex textiles. According to the Daily Mail, scientists have discovered ancient yarn, presumably told by Barry Cryer. Next, what isn't as glamorous as it sounds?
Oh, a golden shower. As I found out to my peril.
It's not that.
Is it Have I Got News for You?
No. Diving for TV and film shoots isn't as glamorous as it sounds. This is from Scuba Diving magazine. The sports section of that magazine is huge because there are 20,000 leagues under the sea. Next, over 10,000 Brits have become what since Brexit vote?
Aware of things that are more important.
Yes, that's very good.
Have become surprisingly appreciative of fruit pickers.
Irish citizens.
I'll give you that. It's not Irish. Over 10,000 Brits have become German, French or Swedish since Brexit vote. It is to do with changing nationality, and according to official EU figures, more Brits are applying for German nationality in order to avoid the feeling of post-Brexit anxiety and the uncertainty of alienation. I imagine the Germans have a very long word for that. And finally, you know what is special when even the Germans are doing it?
Wearing fancy dress.
Comedy?
It's you know that deep sea diving amongst the coral is special when even the Germans are doing it.
There you go. You know diving in the Maldives is special when even the Germans are doing it. Yes, this is an article from Scuba Diver magazine about the joys of going on a diving holiday in the Maldives. And if you're thinking of diving in the Maldives sometime in the future, there are many beautiful things you'll be able to see underwater, like the Maldives. Germans are, of course, big fans of diving. We all remember Jürgen Klinsmann, don't we, Ian?
Was he in Das Boot?
He was wearing a pair of them.
So the final scores are: Ian and Deborah have 3, Paul and Phil have 7.
We can't have lost.
Deborah, myself and Phil are willing to sell 30% of our points for a £10,000 stake on your behalf.
Just trying to work that one out.
Before we go, there's just time for the caption competition.
Bad news, the monkeys got there before us.
That's great. On which note, we say thank you to our panellists Ian Hislop and Deborah Meaden, Paul Merton and Phil Wang. And I leave you with the news that after 2 public shamings, New Zealand's health minister is taking no chances on being spotted as he travels to his holiday home in Greece. And in Bristol, residents, infuriated by a spate of cycle thefts, have found a way of making their bikes unappealing to would-be thieves. Good night.